Another kind of checkmate that is good to be familiar with is the two bishops versus lone king checkmate. For example, in this position, white has two bishops and a king against black's lone king. Here, white will need to use his king to help the two minor pieces checkmate black. However, this checkmate is still very possible and pretty simple to do. The first step is to corner black's king. Now, we notice that the bishop here has lines that prevents the black's king from crossing. The problem is the bishop can only control one color of square. So if this bishop controls this diagonal here, that means it cannot control this diagonal here. So only one bishop can't stop black's king from just moving on all the dark squares, like so. However, if we play bishop to f2, we combine forces with this bishop, so these two bishops control these two diagonals. And now we have formed a wall. Black's king cannot get past these two diagonals, and is now essentially trapped in his own triangle over here. After this, black can play, for example, king to f4. However, we eventually will start to shrink the triangle. So if we can't shrink the triangle right now, for example, bishop to g3 is not possible, we start first by making our king come out, king to f1. We get our king active, and we try to use our king to help the bishops. So he might play something like king to e5. And seeing that we can't make the triangle any smaller, we cannot play bishop to g3 because he simply comes over to this side, then we continue to activate our king, king to e2. If he continues with king to f4, we play king to d3, continuing to activate our own king. Once again, if he plays king to e5, we can continue playing king to c4, and this also continues to activate our own king. Once again, bishop to g3 is not a good idea because the king would be able to go on the other diagonal. So after king to f4, now we can play the move king to d4. We have opposition. This forces the king to no longer stay on this diagonal, and after he plays something like king to, let's say, g4, we can continue moving our king inside until he's forced to give up control of the g3 square. And now we can play the move bishop to g3. We have both of these diagonals covered. Notice that after he plays king to g4, another interesting trait of the two bishops occurs. These two bishops actually control these three squares, which means black's king can never come close to these bishops, and these bishops can never be threatened. So for example, if he plays king to g5 next, we can continue to make this triangle smaller by playing bishop to h3. Notice that with every bishop move, our wall moves closer towards this corner. Our end goal is to move the king towards the h8 corner. So after we place, say, king to h4, harassing our bishop, we want to move our bishop to d7. Why do we move our bishop to d7, not c8? After all, c8's farther, right? We move our bishop to d7 for a very important reason. At d7, when we later put our bishop onto d6, these two bishops once again create that barrier that prevents the king from ever attacking them. However, at d7, the bishop can actually go to e8, which makes the triangle smaller. This bishop here on c8 cannot really go to what is d9 because that square doesn't really exist. So we need to put our bishop on d7 to make progress. So for example, if black plays king to g5, then we can play bishop to d6. Bishop d6, we have our barrier created, and now it's time to try to make this wall even smaller with bishop to e7. So right now, black's king can continue playing king to h4, and now we need to start waiting for the perfect time to play the move bishop to e7. So right now, bishop to e7 doesn't work, because if you do that, he comes onto king g3. So after king to h4, the best idea for white is to play the move king to f3. The idea is to drive black's king out of the h4 square and towards the bishops. Remember that the king can never attack the bishops. So after, for example, king to g5, we play king to g3. And if he plays king to f6, now we can play the move king to g4. The idea is now black's king cannot stay on this diagonal, and after he gives the diagonal away, we can continue pushing his king until finally he is forced to give up control of both the e7 square and this entire diagonal. After this, we can play the move bishop to e7, making the barrier even smaller. Now, if he wants to try to attack us, we can move our bishop anywhere along this diagonal, preferably either d8 or g5. I like g5 because, once again, we can play bishop h6 later to make the barrier even tighter. After he plays king to f8, we can't exactly play bishop to e8, making our barrier smaller yet. so we need to make another waiting move, forcing his king off of the f8 square. Remember, we can't play bishop h6. This doesn't work because his king can now come out. So we need to make sure that we maintain this barrier here and prevent black's king from ever getting out. Alright, so enough with the arrows. We can now play the move king to f6. This forces black to move king to g8, and after king to g8, we can now play the move bishop to e8. We have both of these diagonals covered. So now this barrier is already pretty tight. Black's king only has a very, very small triangle here to work with. And now, if he plays king to f8, we can play bishop to h5. The idea here is that after this move, we have both of these diagonals covered, and we already formed that other barrier here. Oops, this square doesn't count. That keeps the king from attacking the bishops. So after king to g8, we have one last step. We need to make the barrier as small as it can ever be. So bishop to h6. This is the smallest barrier we need. The king is confined to these three squares, and now we have enough to give checkmate. So what do we need to do now? Well, the piece that's not really involved is the king. White's king, however, is not the piece that will be giving checkmate. A king cannot checkmate the other king, because obviously the king has to be next to the other king, and that just doesn't work. So we need to use our king to replace the bishop. Well, which bishop? Well, this bishop already controls these three squares, and this bishop controls these couple squares. This square isn't very important, and this square is very important, because those are the squares that keep the king from getting out. We need to use this king to replace the light square bishop in order to control this square. So how do we do this? Well, it's black to move, so he might come and attack our bishop. We need to defend our bishop now, right? Playing this and repeating moves doesn't really help anymore. So after he plays a king to h7, we need to play king to g5. We defend the h6 bishop. After defending the h6 bishop, black can play king to g8. And now, this is a very important move. We play the move king to g6. The king defends the f7 square, and the bishop defends the f8 square. The king cannot get past either of these. Therefore, black's limited to only these two squares. Notice that the king also restricts black's connection onto this h7 square. Okay, so now it looks like we're ready to give checkmate. We should play bishop to g7, and after this, black only has one square to work with, g8. So obviously it should be easy checkmate, right? Well, that's not so right. Why? Because after king to g8, we can't really play anything like bishop to f3 because that would be a stalemate. So maybe we shouldn't play bishop g7 that fast. We might want to reposition this bishop since it's not doing anything anymore. Remember that the king covers the f7 square so that this king can never come out. So this bishop doesn't need to be on h5 anymore. Let's move it over. Moving it over anywhere doesn't really matter, so we can just move it, let's say f3. It doesn't matter which square you go to. The key is that after he plays king to g8, we can give check on this diagonal. So after giving check on the a2 to g8 diagonal, black's king is forced into h8, and now black's king has no squares to work with, so if we give check, it's going to be checkmate. Well, that's perfect. We can play bishop to g7, checkmate. Now, I know this was a lot, so let's do a little bit of a review. Going all the way from the beginning, yep, over here. Our first step was to create our barrier, right? We first lined up our two bishops next to each other, and we created a barrier. Then, after creating the barrier, our next step was to activate the king. Remember that we cannot always make the barrier smaller, right? The barrier cannot always be made smaller because the king sometimes is on the diagonal. So the key is to use our own king to squish his king off of the diagonal. And you should also remember that these two bishops are not really touchable because they control these four squares, and that means that the king cannot get close to either one of them. Then we continue to get our king more active, and after a couple of moves, black is eventually forced by opposition to give up his spot on this diagonal. Now, it still takes a couple more moves to squish black's king completely inside so that the two bishops can make a new barrier. So after his king gives up control, we can finally move our bishop in and start creating another barrier. Now, if he attacks us, no big deal. We can just move away. And we can now play the move bishop to h3. After this, we have made a new barrier, as you can see now, right? So we continue to make the barrier smaller. The idea is to use our king when we can't use our bishops. So we completely push him towards the other side. And now we can make our barrier smaller, like so. Alright, so now our barrier has become smaller again. And this time, we can continue pushing his king towards the h8 square. After king to f8, we can play bishop to h5. And finally, after bishop h6, we see that we've made the barrier as small as possible. We know it's time to get our king involved because after king to h7, we can see that bishop to f8 here, followed by king to g8, and then bishop h6, king h7. We're just repeating moves here. So it's obvious to us now that our king needs to come into the battle and defend the bishop on h6. So now we need to play the move king to g5. This defends the bishop and forces black to move again. Black moves king to g8, and this move allows white to play king to g6. The whole point of king to g6 is to control the f7 and h7 squares. Of course, h7 restricts the king's access, and he only has 2 squares to move now. And by controlling f7, the king releases the bishop from the h5 square, where it can later on come around and give check on this a2 to g8 diagonal. So after king to g8, we can't rush with bishop to g7 yet. That would not be checkmate because after king to g8, black runs out of squares to use. So the key here is to wait a move. We first play bishop to e2, for example. And after his king moves away, we can first give a check over here, forcing his king here onto h8. And now black's king has no squares left to go. We can play the move bishop to g7, checkmate. And that's how you checkmate with 2 bishops against the lone king.